Which of these two cameras is the better hybrid shooter? The mighty Sony A7IV or the fantastic Sony A6700? Before we get started though, let me know if you can tell which is which in the comments. Camera A was the Sony A7IV and camera B was the Sony A6700. I just want to say we have two brilliant cameras here. You can't really go wrong with either of these, but we have got two very different systems on our hands. We've got full frame and we've got APS-C. You can actually see the sensor on the A7IV is much larger than it is on the A6700. And that's going to give you a wider field of view, but that's not the only thing because there are benefits to both. And we're going to be looking at all of these differences and all these different things throughout today's video. So if this is your first camera, you might be thinking what system to go into, or if you already have an APS-C camera, is 2023 the year to switch to full frame? And I'm sure by the end of today's video, you'll know which of these two cameras is right for you. And please let me know in the comment section below, which one do you prefer? When any of us here go out and buy something, we always look for value. Good bang for our buck, right? And when it comes to value, I think the A6700 is the best Sony currently offers for price to performance when it comes to their hybrid cameras. Retailing at £1,449 is a heck of a lot cheaper than the Sony A7IV, which is near as damn it £900 more expensive. But this is where we need to start looking at the differences between these two cameras, because there are some stuff that the A6700 does and this one simply doesn't do. But then there are some stuff this camera does and this one might also do it, but maybe not as well. It swings in roundabouts, you see. So what I think we should start by doing is having a look at the specs of both of these cameras. Oh, I've got dust in the sensor. Oh no! Starting with the A6700, which is equipped with a 26 megapixel APS-C back illuminated CMOS sensor, whilst the Sony A7IV has a 33 megapixel full frame BSI CMOS sensor. In terms of autofocus, the A6700 is powered by the new AI processor, and if I'm honest, it's absolutely incredible. We can target a wide range of subjects, humans, animals, insects, cars, trains and planes. It's a lightning fast system that is even more reliable and by far the best autofocus system that I have seen on any camera ever. It has simply blown me away. Don't get me wrong, the autofocus on the A7IV is really good as well. For my time owning it and using it on the daily, it's rarely skipped a beat. It's just this is better. In terms of video with the A6700, you can film up to 4K 60 FPS in APS-C and 4K at 120 FPS in a crop mode. Despite that crop, it still looks incredible and amazing to me that a camera at this price point offers this incredible feature. Plus, you can film at 240 FPS in 1080p. On the other hand, the Sony A7IV doesn't offer 4K 120. It can film up to 4K 60, but even this is done within an APS-C crop mode, and it can only do 1080 up to 120 FPS. Now, before we dive any deeper into these comparisons, I do have to put on the brakes for a second because we do need to talk about the biggest difference between these two cameras, and that is full frame versus APS-C. Now essentially the key benefit of shooting with a full frame camera is the ability to control the depth of field. So f1.4 on an APS-C camera will always look less shallow to an f1.4 on a full frame camera. Essentially when you use an APS-C camera you have to times that by 1.5. So as an example, let's take this Sigma 56 f1.4 which is designed for APS-C cameras. When we times that focal length by 1.5 times, it gives us the equivalent of an 85mm focal length. When we times that f1.4 aperture by 1.5 times, it gives us an aperture equivalent to f2.2 at the end of the day. Full frame cameras are also technically better with low light performance, but to be fair, I've tested out both of these cameras shooting in lower light conditions and they both do an incredible job. In terms of body sizes, when talking about APS-C cameras, especially from Sony, they're always going to be smaller. Smaller body, smaller sensor, smaller everything. The A7IV is a full frame camera, so everything I just mentioned that's smaller on APS-C is going to be bigger here on full frame. In terms of portability, the A6700 is a lot better for traveling and as an everyday carry. It's more compact, but not actually massively different in terms of its weight. The A6700 here is 503 grams, and the A7IV is 669 grams, so there's only 166 grams between the two, which ain't much. I mean, that's about the weight difference of a phone. So what it really comes down to is what lenses are you going to be putting on the front of these cameras, and with this being the Sony E-mount, there are a ton to choose from for both APS-C and full frame. A key benefit here though, with APS-C cameras, we can utilize using both full frame and APS-C lenses on this system. Now of course we can use APS-C cameras on a full frame camera, but in order to do so we need to be in a Super 35 crop mode to avoid any kind of vignetting. But as a consequence, if we do this, we'll be getting less resolution from our camera as it will be in a crop mode and not giving a full sensor readout. Now I think one of the biggest differences between these two cameras come down to the SD card slots, with the A7 IV only having a single slot, whilst the A7 IV has a dual slot, with one of those being able to support a Type A card, which are a more reliable and durable card, but are quite a bit more expensive. I don't own one because they're way too rich for my blood. For hobbyists or semi-professionals, a single SD card slot should be grand, but more often than not, working professionals do prefer to have dual SD card slots opposed to one, so that could be a big deal for some people. Both of these sensors are downsampled, so the Sony A7 IV is downsampled from 7K to 4K up to 30 FPS, and the A6700 is downsampled from 6K to 4K up to 60 FPS. Now this means you're going to get a slightly sharper image from the A7 IV, but unless you zoom all the way into your footage, it's really hard to see the difference. If I'm honest, both of them look fantastic. But if I'm right in thinking here, interestingly, the 4K 60 on the A6700 is slightly sharper than the 4K 60 on the A7 IV. As I mentioned earlier, when you go into 4K 60 on the A7 IV, it goes into a crop mode, which means then you are not shooting a 7K image downsampled to 4K, you are just shooting 4K. Whilst this one at 4K 60 doesn't go into an additional crop mode, so you're still getting 6K downsampled to 4K. Granted, the Sony A7 IV does have a slight advantage over the A6700 when it comes to dynamic range. I believe we get an extra stop out of the A7 IV, but for my time testing out the A6700, I've not thought at one point, dang it, if only I had an extra stop of dynamic range. With the AI processor on the A6700, we also do get auto framing. I think this was a feature a little bit too hyped up upon release. It's cool and all, but I wouldn't ever find myself using it. I mean, I've never seen a creator using this feature unless it's just to demonstrate how it works, like I'm doing literally right now. I think now would be a grand old time to have a look at some of the similarities between these two cameras. For instance, they can both film 422 10-bit video internally, which I firmly believe is going to be the new standard going forward for all Sony cameras. I do actually think this is the first A6000 series of camera to receive a 10-bit sensor. I'm always using S-Log3 anytime I'm using either of these cameras, and both of them are a breeze and a lot of fun to work with when it comes to colour grading. So for filmmaking, this is famdiddlyumptious. They're also both equipped with 5-axis in-body stabilisation, but the Sony A7 IV does have a slight edge here because it's 5.5 compared to 5.0 on the A6700. Both cameras are equipped with an active stabilisation mode for video, which uses electronical stabilisation with just a 1.1 times crop. Now, it would be illegal to compare these two hybrid cameras if I didn't talk about something I love doing just as much as breathing, and that is, of course, photography. Now, I do have to say straight off the bat, both of these cameras are incredible when it comes to photography. I have been able to rack so many great shots off with both of these cameras in a multitude of shooting scenarios. So what I'm going to do is focus some photos on screen to see if you can tell which photos were taken with the A6700 and which were taken with the A7 IV. So without telling any porcupines, were you able to tell the difference? Well, if you said A was the A6700, then you're right on the money. To keep the test you've just seen as fair as possible, I was using very similar lenses on both cameras. The brilliant Sigma 18-50 on the A6700, and the versatile King that of the Sigma 24-70 on the A7 IV. So when it comes to the sensors, both of these are excellent for capturing photographs, but to be fair, that could be said about any sensor really in the last 5 years. years or so. What I find interesting is that in most shooting scenarios, it can be difficult to tell which photo was taken with an APS-C or full frame sensor. The biggest giveaway was definitely in the photos where I got close to the subjects and you can see more of that background blur. Shutter speed is where the A7IV does have the advantage because this can shoot up to 1/8000th of a second mechanical, whilst the A6700 is capped at 1/4000th. But if you go into the electronical mode on the A6700, you can then achieve 1/8000th of a second shutter speed. When it comes to burst shooting, this is where the A6700 does have a slight advantage because this will do 11 frames per second, whilst the A7IV is capped at 10 frames per second. So not really much in it. But the A6700 does have an increased buffer speed, so you're not waiting for the camera to clear that buffer. It writes to the memory card straight away so you can shoot for longer in those burst modes. The Sony A7IV is a phenomenal camera, but then again, so is the Sony A6700. You would have to say though, the A6700 is better value over the A7IV because this does everything the A7IV does plus a little bit extra for less. For the price you pay for the body of a Sony A7IV, you can have a Sony A6700, a Sigma 18-50 f2.8, a Sigma 56 f1.4, and still have leftover wonga to get yourself a camera bag, memory card, some filters, and maybe even my preset packs, which you can check out in the description below. So what you really need to take into consideration when choosing between these two cameras is, do you require a full-size HDMI port? Do you need dual SD card slots? Do you desire a bigger camera body? Do you want a full frame sensor and want to utilize full frame lenses? If so, the Sony A7IV will be your best bet. On the flip side to that, if you're not that kind of person, then the A6700 is gonna be perfect for you. It's gonna tick all the right boxes for both photography and filmmaking. So look here, if you want to get started with both photography and filmmaking, then I would highly recommend the Sony A6700. I would actually say this is a better hybrid camera than the A7IV, which is kind of crazy to say. If you are looking to upgrade from the A6400 or ZBE10 and want to go full frame, for now, I would actually say hold your horses and put that money into an A6700 and get yourself a couple of extra lenses. I think that would be a better upgrade than going to the A7IV, in my opinion. Now, if you want to see how the Sony A6700 performs in lower light conditions, then definitely check out this top video right here. And if you want to see how I've set up the A6700 for both photography and filmmaking with a full setup guide, then definitely check out the bottom video right here. But with all that said, until next time, create, explore, and inspire.